This video is not going to get super graphic, but you might want to put on headphones if you're at work, because we're going to penetrate society's sick, gray fear of the flesh here. Drink deep or taste not the plasma spring. And I'm not just talking about sex and penetration.
I'm talking about penetration beyond the veil of the flesh. A deep, penetrating dive into the plasma pool.
That's right, Jeff Goldblum. Thank you. Could not have said it better. So I was scrolling through my timeline when I saw this.
Mess with me or mine again and I shall forget you are family. Do you believe yourself strong enough to stand against me? Against death? Against destiny?
Here comes, Netflix's intern or whatever to tell me, if you thought that this scene that we filmed in a very provocative way implied that they were fucking, check in on yourself. Didn't you film the scene? So I want to talk about that particular way Netflix engages with fandom, because I've seen them do it before. I also want to talk about the language of desire in film and how sometimes fandom-ish discourses really flatten that discussion into something less vibrant and full and meaningful than it could be. A lot of the more feminine parts of fandom are organized around shipping. If you don't know what shipping is, congratulations. It is the fandom activity of cheering for two characters within a work to bone. Shipping has been around since at least the 1960s. My mother was a big Kirk and Spock shipper, apparently. I've heard rumors that the fighting between the people who shipped Han and Leia and Luke escalated to the point where somebody drove to Harrison Ford's house and threw drawn pornography all over his lawn. So things can get pretty heated in fandom, but right now, shipping wars aren't the big fight. The big fight, I am out of fandom, thank fucking God, is between pro-shippers and anti-shippers. Back when NBC's show Hannibal came out, a significant portion of the Hannibal fandom wanted Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter to get it on. Hannibal Lecter is a serial killer? And the reaction to that was, yeah, Hannibal Lecter is hot. Will Graham is hot. I don't see the fucking problem. So somehow this turned into World War III. I don't know all the details of this. I really don't want to. I just know that it really escalated to the point where there were death threats, where people were like justifying that kind of behavior by saying that people who shipped Will Graham and Hannibal Lecter were like pro-domestic violence, perpetuated attitudes that caused murders, like shit like that. So when Netflix does this, they know what they're doing. They are both appealing to the people who would find this particular ship hot and appealing to the anti-shippers who think that the shippers are gross and wrong. And I have feelings about this, not like as a pro-shipper or an anti-shipper. I am out of fandom. But as a person who consumes media and who does not want to interact with it in a fandom kind of way. If that's how you want to interact with media, like have a party, I'm not gonna attend, best of luck. I am very concerned, however, that the way we make media, the way we promote media, the way we critique media is increasingly influenced by this fandom mode of interaction. And I think the topic that most suffers when we talk about media in a very fanish way is desire. I'm choosing my words very carefully here. I don't mean sex. I don't mean lust. Might mean libido, but we'll get to that. I mean desire. Cribbing from The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, I want to talk about 3 ways desire is portrayed on film. First, gaze. Second, the intercession of the unnatural into the natural world. And third, sex. In Netflix's You, our hero, Joe, falls in love with witty, beautiful writer Beck at first sight. So he goes about setting up rom-com-esque moments to make her fall in love with him. Joe is a serial killer. I love You, and I wish I loved it more. It ping-pongs back and forth between a show that's very much like Dexter and then a show that's very much like a romantic comedy. Placing these two genres next to each other in the same show is, especially in the first season, deeply witty. Joe is funny, he's attractive, and he is creepy as hell. But there's one thing holding the show back, and I think it's typified by how Penn Badgley handles it when people tell him that Joe is hot. The amount of people romanticizing Penn Badgley's character in You scares me. Ditto. It will be all the motivation I need for season 2. Nobody said this already, but Penn Badgley is breaking my heart once again as Joe. What is it about him? He's a murderer. Okay, but Penn Badgley was sexy as Dan, but Lord, Joe is a whole new level of problems, right? He's been kind of clear that he thinks there's something creepy and wrong about people who think that Joe is hot, which is fair. Joe is, a serial killer who, spoilers for the first season of You, kills Beck. Here's a quote that he gave during an interview. There are so many stories in the media about what we currently call toxic masculinity, and I feel like that still doesn't get to the depth of the phenomenon. It's just really interesting that this show of all shows is so popular right now. I wonder if, as a viewer, no matter how much you've enjoyed the frothiness of the show, you can't get away with liking Joe without taking responsibility for being part of Beck's death. Whew, that's a lot to unpack. I'm a domestic violence survivor. I'm not going to go into all the kinds of abuse I've been through, but just assume all of them. That'd work. And there's something deeply unkind, I feel, about pointing to me and asking, why do you find Joe hot? Here's why I find him hot. They cast Penn Badgley. They made Joe funny. They do long, lingering shots of Joe's face and body. They use the cinematic language of romantic comedy to direct my gaze at Joe. Here's a scene where Joe has followed Beck to her apartment and is spying on her. The peeping Tom scene as a romantic trope has thankfully fallen out of vogue, but it's still in heavy use in films that are about obsession. In a peeping Tom scene, the person who desires spots the object of his or her desire through a window or through a veil. This demarcation between spaces, between the real world of the person who desires and the unreal world where the object of desire resides, is important. The object of desire in these scenes isn't always sex. In Rear Window and Francis Ford Coppola's The Conversation, the object of desire is murder. In You, the line between the real world and the fantasy world through the window is made even more explicit when Joe immediately starts fantasizing about making love with Beck. What's happening in the real world, however, is that Joe has put his hand down his pants. Penn Badgley has given an interview about filming this scene. He says that they had to redo it because he didn't close his eyes. And that's very interesting because how a character looks, where they look, tells us something about what they desire. I personally believe that when you close Joe's eyes within this scene, you turn him from the thing that desires, the thing that needs in this predatory way, to the recipient of the audience's desire. We're the only ones with our eyes open. We're the ones who are looking at Joe. And I think that's an interesting choice, legitimately. I think it's very cool and interesting to interrogate this stalker as the object of our desire. However, we're not the ones who decided that Joe was the object of desire in this scene. You know, we didn't cast Penn Badgley. We didn't tell him to close his eyes. They made a series of decisions to present Joe in this way. Interpreting Joe in that way, therefore, is not like a problem with us. It's just being able to read, if that makes sense. My sense of You and how it's constructed is the production team, like Penn Badgley, believe that the show is an indictment of the audience and their desires. And I think that holds it back, because I think the more interesting show would be about how media constructs desire, how it tells you to desire somebody like Joe. So moving on, the intercession of the unnatural. Again, pulling from The Pervert's Guide to Cinema, regardless of what we believe, human beings experience our own existence as a little bit uncanny. We are lumps of meat possessed by a ghost with a voice, possessed of a libido. Let me define libido here, because it means something very specific in Freudian analysis. Very roughly defined, the libido is whatever it is that would drive you to do something beyond sitting in a dark room silently doing nothing. And because we generally experience libidinous urges as something a little bit outside of ourselves, like we don't look at a glass of water and think, my body wants me to drink. We desire water. It just comes to us. So one of the shorthands for desire in media is an intercessory supernatural force that pierces the veil between the natural and the unnatural. I talked about Hellraiser kind of at length in an interview I did recently, but I'm going to bring it up again here because you can't stop me. Hellraiser starts with Frank, who is this absolute monster. He is abusive, he is masochistic, and he's looking for the ultimate experience. So he looks for it in the supernatural. He finds the lament configuration, he opens it, and is torn apart by the Cenobites. The Cenobites don't strictly have to be in Hellraiser. Like, the movie would work just fine if it was Frank under the floorboards, demanding that his abused lover bring him flesh and blood to rebuild himself. The Cenobites are there to reinforce that this is a movie about desire. People don't just have positive drives, they have drives to destroy themselves. I think my favorite example of the death drive in Freud is repetition compulsion. Little babies, if they injure themselves, can sometimes be observed repeating the injury over and over and over again because babies have a drive to mastery. Freud thought that because we can't gain mastery over pain, we don't ever lose that urge to touch the hot stove over and over again. People do this. They repeat past trauma. They go through a horrible experience with an ex, seek out somebody who's just like their ex, do all of the same things, and it doesn't work. It Follows is another fascinating example of libido as death drive. If you are the target of the monster in It Follows, it can look like anyone and it goes after you very, very slowly. But if it catches you, it will tear you apart. The only way to escape the monster, at least temporarily, is to have sex with another person who then becomes the target of the monster's rage. If the monster kills that person, it continues going after you again. So when our protagonist is cursed by a stranger in a one-night stand, it's this profoundly violent act that's been done to her, and it transforms all of her relationships and what sex means within them. There's a completely heartbreaking scene where one of Jay's friends volunteers to have sex with her as this weird, supremely selfless act of love, not because he desires her, but because he wants to protect her from being the object of the monster's rage. People rarely have sex just to have sex. Again, to lift from Zizek, we've all had that experience while having sex, those of us who have had sex, of briefly disassociating from the experience and seeing ourselves as these ridiculous animals sweating, going through a repetitive motion, being just a little bit silly, and that isn't fun. When we make love, we're reaching for pleasure or love or even something darker, to be destroyed, to feel like we don't exist for one brief moment. But we don't do it to feel like a body going through the motions. The final way I want to talk about in which desire is portrayed on film is through sex. So to talk about that, I'm going to talk about a film in which precisely zero sex takes place, Mary Reilly. Mary Reilly is a retelling of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and in theory, it should work. It should work so well. Mary Reilly is a maid who has an extensive abuse and neglect history, who comes into the service of Dr. Jekyll, who is a gentle, sweet man, and she begins to fall in love. And of course, her desire for a good, sweet man as a woman who's only experienced male sexuality as this brutish, violent thing is summoning the brutish and violent Hyde. Mary Reilly is the worst film I have ever seen 5 or 6 times. Now, to be fair to me, most of those times were on HBO when I was about 13 or 14 and you just watched whatever was on. But I definitely watched it whenever it was on. And it's the only film I am actively embarrassed to talk about. And even just beyond the accents.
I'm not going to bite you.
I'm sorry, sir. You gave me a fright.
Something is off with the film. The pacing is wrong. It is both too horny and not horny enough. It's both too violent and not violent enough. I don't know what they could have done to save this damn thing. But the film does a couple of things really, really right. First of all, it's built around some really viscerally confronting sexual images. Jesus Christ. This is horrific. The dialogue is real bad. It's really bad. It's not good. Please don't look upon my shame. I'm begging you not to watch Mary Reilly. Please. It's available on Tubi, but don't. The movie does a really pretty good job of not reassuring the audience or Mary that she's going to be spared in any way from this guy's violence, which I think is the good and correct move for a horror movie. The second thing I think they do correctly, despite John Malkovich kind of struggling to make this dialogue work, is casting John Malkovich. In the late 80s through the 90s, John Malkovich was typecast as the guy you are alarmed to be sexually attracted to. John Malkovich's second most famous role at this point is probably the Vicomte de Valmont in Dangerous Liaisons, this predatory seducer and manipulator of women who falls in love with one of his targets. And if you go in blind, you might think that John Malkovich is a little bit miscast for this. He's not a handsome guy, I would say. He's an interesting to look at man. He's got kind of a gangly frame, and he doesn't emote very much, not through his voice, not through his face, but what he does do is project an intensity. He has a very deliberate gaze. He's also got some very beautiful body movements, so he is physically interesting to look at if you spend some time with him. I think it's fair to say that the repeated theme he comes back to over and over again is desire, both the sex drive and the death drive. He's very good at the interplay between the two. He's often within the same scene, both threatening and alluring. There was a thread recently on Twitter asking, why is being John Malkovich about John Malkovich? Why not anybody else? Why not somebody more attractive? Why not somebody more known? And I think it's because of his embodiment as this thing that desires. You want to be John Malkovich because John Malkovich is very good at wanting. This is, I think, the first time on film that John Malkovich, an actor you hire when you need somebody to desire, becomes the object of desire. Here's a reviewer contemporary to being John Malkovich describing the allure of John Malkovich. To open up and accept him in a role as a charismatic sex object is not unlike the feeling of sexual surrender itself. So it's not just me, I am still weird, but I'm not alone. Back to Mary Reilly, I apologize. The reason why I'm so embarrassed to talk about it is because the only reason I could possibly recommend it to you is because it's the horniest film I have ever seen in my entire life. And nobody has sex. You would think, well, maybe it could be more about fucking if they had, actual fucking in it. And no. If Mary and Dr. Jekyll were of the same class, psychiatrically healthy, not secretly a murderer of prostitutes, they could just get together and have some nice, lovely sex and some babies and live happily ever after. And that would not be a story about desire. That would be a story about fulfillment. So, bringing it back to some very fandom-inflected cultural criticism, sometimes you'll see people bemoan the fact that people want to see over and over again these obsession love stories about a bright, pretty, innocent young thing who yearns for somebody who is terrible. I think people, especially if they get older, certainly if they get wiser, start to recognize that not every impulse they have is toward the good. That sometimes what we desire when we have sex or when we do anything, remember, libido is not just about sex. It's about going out and doing anything in the world. So sometimes in the safe place of fiction, we want to explore the monstrous. We want to explore what exactly we feel when we feel the intercessory force of desire pierce the veil of the mundane and pull us in. That doesn't mean you can't be critical of media or interrogate desire. And I think a good place to start is by asking ourselves, why is it Netflix, who produced Sandman, wants us to talk about this particular scene in this particular way? They want us to turn our eye inward toward our desires and ask, what is wrong with me if I read sex into this scene? What that obscures is the choices that Netflix made when it filmed this scene, when it advertised this scene, when it brought this scene to our attention in this way. Why do they want us to look at ourselves and not at them? If you're still here, leave a comment down below. I love hearing from people. I love discussing this. I will probably respond. If you like the topic of this video, you might check out my conversation with Matthew Dawkins, where we go on a significant Hellraiser tangent. It's a lot of fun. I think you'll love it.